Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Lunar Display, MacStadium, and Linode. I'm John Voorhees, and with me as always is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing all right. It's super early in the morning, and I'll explain why that is. We don't usually record super early in the morning, but we've got a special episode today, because what we haven't done in a long time on App Stories is do an interview, and we figured we'd correct that today, and we've got with us a special guest. We've got Zac Cohan, who's the developer of Soulver, and Zac's been working on Soulver for, a really long time now. We'll get into some of his background and how he got started and a bunch of other things. But I wanted to welcome you to the show, Zac. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, John. Nice to meet you. And you too, Federico.
So why don't we get started, Zac? Because I feel like this is a very fascinating story of your company, Aqualia, and Soulver. So what can you tell us about how you got started with developing Soulver and just Mac development in general?
Sure. So the story starts in 2005, actually. I was 17 years old and in my final year of high school. And over the Christmas holidays, our kind of summer break, my good friend at school, Nick, had been working on a little calculator app, essentially to teach himself to program. And I had done a little bit of dabbling in programming the year before, year 11, and I'd written a little geography game called World of Where. Really simple. It would just have a map of the world, and you'd go to different continents. It would ask you, where is Paris? And you click France, and it would say yes. Really simple thing. And so, yeah, Nick had done his little hobby project, just making this kind of traditional little calculator thing. And I was looking at this and thinking, this is just not a great product. It's not something we could really sell. And it just seemed kind of crazy to me that we had these really powerful Macs with their beautiful, graphical user interfaces and powerful processors, and yet we were kind of limiting ourselves by the traditional design of a standard handheld calculator. For example, it seemed crazy to me that you needed to hit equals in order to get an answer. I mean, at the time I had a PowerMac G5 Tower with 2 processors and all of this processing power, and yet I still had to hit equals when I was ready to get my answer. The other thing that just seemed crazy was it had this tiny little display. A little calculator has a 1-line display. I've got this beautiful big Apple Cinema display, and I'm using a tiny little piece of it. But the real fatal flaw to me in this whole approach of the traditional calculator design was that you had to use another notepad or a notepad app or a physical piece of paper to actually work through a problem. The calculator is great for little simple calculations, but if you actually want to work through some kind of task, get a solution to a problem that you're working with, you really need to be going back and forwards between a notepad and the calculator. You write out your problem on paper, and you go to the calculator and you punch in your numbers, and you go back to the paper. And this back and forth just seemed crazy to me. And so Nick and I started thinking about how we could perhaps redesign the calculator for our Macs, which we loved, and to design around these problems. And so what we came up with was the same Soulver interface that we use today in Soulver 3, which is just this kind of notepad on the left and this column on the right, which gives you answers line by line. And this seemed really natural to us at the time, because when you write equations on paper, you often have the problem on the left and the answer on the right. And it solved the other problems as well. We could just calculate as you typed, and that was just trivial because computers are powerful. And you would be able to see your entire problem. You'd be able to work through the problem line by line like you would on paper. And so once we had this idea, we thought, this is great. This is going to be so much better than a calculator. And we started building it. And it took us about 5 months from our Christmas holidays, halfway into our final year of high school. And our parents were a bit confused because we should have been studying for our state exams at the end of the year, but we were so kind of enthused with this idea that we had that it consumed most of our time. And it was fine. We did fine in our exams at the end. But yeah, so I did most of the graphical, like the interface side of things, because I'd had a bit of experience with that. and Nick took on the task of making a math engine work, something that would evaluate a mathematical expression and give you an answer. And I thought we did pretty good for two kids who had very little programming experience. We had no one at school who knew anything about computers and programming, really. We went to a Steiner school, which is a kind of an alternative teaching philosophy. It's very good, and I loved school. It's very into creativity and music and art and stuff, but they don't really think very highly of computers, especially for younger kids. So we never really had any computers at school, but we both just loved our Macs, and so this was a hobby project and something which we actually thought would be a great idea. So that's how it all started.
Where does Picturesque fit into this? Because I know that was also an early app that you worked on and one that you actually won an ADA for in 2007 as a student project. What's the story behind that?
Once we built the original Soulver, we kind of got back to working on our school exams and stuff. It didn't sell very well, and for me, part of the issue was that it was we wrote it in this technology called Real Basic, which was this great drag and drop tool with a very simple language for kind of learning to program and making simple apps. But it was built on Apple's Carbon APIs, and it was this cross-platform tool, and so the app that was produced wasn't particularly Mac-y, which was not really what we wanted, because we wanted something that felt really at home with the Mac. I've always loved the Mac. I grew up this was my biggest passion. I was watching Steve Jobs keynotes in 98, 99. My dad was in desktop publishing, so we always had Macs around. And so I've been using Macs for years to just make things with whatever tools I could find. So I just loved the Mac. I loved productivity tools. And so when we built Soulver and it didn't feel Mac-y, that was disappointing to us. And so Nick said, well, we have to learn Apple's real programming tools, Cocoa, as it's called. And this to me seemed kind of ridiculous at the time because, we weren't real programmers. We were using this kind of hobby programming tool. And Cocoa was real programming. This was learning C and then learning Objective-C, which seemed really hard the first time we had a look at these things. Just strange syntaxes and little asterisks and semicolons and oh my gosh. But we decided this is what we had to do to make it how we wanted it. And so we spent kind of the next few months after releasing the original Soulver doing our exams and also whenever we could learning C and Objective-C. And then over the next Christmas holidays, we rewrote Soulver again in Cocoa and re-released it. It was much nicer. We had access to the beautiful font panel that comes in macOS 10 and the color wheel, and it just felt great. And so based on that, we actually won student scholarships to go to WWDC in San Francisco. And this was a really big deal for us. There was this organization around at the time called the AUC. And I think it was just for Australians because I'm not sure exactly how it worked, but it was this university organization that was sort of funded by Apple, and they would give scholarships to students at universities in Australia. And Nick and I did pretty well on our exams, and we went to university the year after, and we applied for this scholarship to go to WWDC. Everything paid for, our flights, our tickets, our accommodation. And we kind of held Soulver up as an example of something we're working on, and they thought that was really cool. And so we won the scholarship. And usually they don't give it to first-year uni students, but based on Soulver, they said, we'll let you guys go. And so we went to WWDC, and we made all these great friends, and it was this interesting period of time for Mac software. We called it the Delicious generation. Delicious Library had come out, and it was this whole phase of building beautiful graphical user interfaces with, it's the skeuomorphism thing. I loved it. App Zapper was a big one, and it had the icon of a little ray gun and the sound effect.
I remember that. Yes.
It would delete all the files from apps in your system. And, then the App Zapper guys made Disco, which was like a disk burning app, which smoke would come off. It was all about beautiful new experimentations with UI. And so we met a lot of these other developers working on stuff like that, and we thought, wow, it would be cool to make a kind of our own contribution to that. And the app idea we came up with was a really simple image effects app, which we ended up calling Picturesque. And it was going to be really simple. It wasn't going to be about putting filters on images. It was about just really tasteful, simple effects that worked well together, maybe for adding just a little bit of an embellishment to images for your website. So something like a shadow, maybe some curved corners selectively, a stroke, maybe a nice reflection, maybe a bit of a 3D effect. And so we made this really simple tool that had a nice icon, it had a nice name. You could do batch image processing, it had automator actions, so it kind of worked well with the system. And Apple thought that was pretty great for a student app. And we won an Apple Design Award the next year, the following year. And we were back at WWDC on another student scholarship. We didn't know about this in advance, that we were winning any award. We only found out sitting in the audience and it being announced that we'd won the award. It was an amazing feeling. Suddenly we're up on stage and getting the beautiful glowing cube. As John Galenzi would show off Picturesque to all the app developers in the audience. So it was really, really cool. It was a dream come true. We were 19 at the time, so we were pretty young to get this, and yeah, that's where Picturesque came from.
That's really cool. I mean, it's interesting to me how the student scholarship programs have kind of evolved and changed over the years because, today they still have those and it seems like the process has settled down and become more regular, but they don't fly people out, I don't believe, anymore. So it can be really difficult for people, depending where you live in the world, it can be very difficult to get to San Jose for WWDC. It's pretty neat that you guys were able to get there on Apple's dime all the way from Australia.
It was very cool. I mean, especially for Australians as well. Pretty tricky as a student to get to San Francisco.
Right.
Very expensive flights, and then you pay for accommodation and stuff. Yeah. So it was, we were very, very lucky. This was an amazing organization. And we ended up actually teaching iOS development once the iOS SDK came out as well, to different groups of students and staff from different universities around Australia, as through that organization too. But a few years ago, Apple actually defunded them. They decided it wasn't important anymore. And so, unfortunately, that's not in existence anymore. There's still the standard student scholarships, but that particular scholarship fund is not going. So we were, it was right time in history for us to get that.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Lunar Display. Lunar Display is the only hardware solution that turns your iPad or Mac into a wireless display. Luna sets up in mere seconds and instantly works over Wi-Fi or USB for those times when you don't have a Wi-Fi network available. And unlike Sidecar's limited 10-meter range, Luna will work as far as your Wi-Fi network can reach. My Wi-Fi network reaches out into the backyard, and that's how I use my Lunar Display sometimes. Luna works in 3 separate modes. There's Mac to iPad mode, Mac to Mac, and headless mode. With Luna's newly released Mac to Mac mode, you can use any Mac as a secondary display for your primary Mac. It's the perfect way to use an old Mac that you have lying around that's underutilized. And because it works with Mac OS going back all the way to 10.8, which is Mountain Lion, it covers an awful lot of older Macs. Luna's headless mode is another great feature because you can use it to run something like a headless Mac Mini, which is something that I do for a Plex server that I've got down in my basement. I don't have to go downstairs and adjust things on my Plex server. I can use the Lunar Display on my iPad or now a Mac in order to just change things on the Plex server. It's a fantastic way to do it from anywhere in my home. And of course, there's Mac to iPad mode. Luna turns your iPad into a complete extension of your Mac with full support for external keyboards, Apple Pencil, and touch interactions. It literally turns your Mac into a touchscreen device. Luna runs on a proprietary video technology called Liquid, which was originally engineered to meet the workflow demands of professional digital artists. Liquid guarantees stunning image quality and virtually zero lag. App Stories listeners can get an exclusive 15% discount on Lunar Display. Just visit lunadisplay.com and enter the promo code STORIES at checkout. Again, that URL, it's lunadisplay.com and the promo code STORIES at checkout to get 15% off on this terrific device. Our thanks to Lunar Display for their support of App Stories.
So when did you feel like you were onto something with Soulver and Picturesque? Like when did you feel like, this making apps can actually sort of be like a job? Was it like an immediate thing? Was it like your goal at the beginning, or was it something that you realized as you were releasing updates and different versions? Was there like a particular moment, maybe, an article on a certain website or anything that made you feel like we made something here. This could be popular.
Yeah, good question. So Picturesque did really well. The day we released it, it ended up on the front of Apple's downloads tab. Remember back in the day, you'd go to Apple's homepage and there was downloads in the top right. It was before the App Store. And Apple it featured the screenshot of it right there. It actually brought down our whole web server. We were on a shared host and it was a bit of a nightmare. We just got featured and then we lost our host. We got it back a couple of days later. But so that was pretty big. And as a result of the Apple Design Award, we were offered scholarships. We were offered internships. At Apple. So that was like, wow, okay, we're now going to actually be in Cupertino working on Apple's products. This is kind of another dream come true. As someone who had been following Apple since I was like 9, this is like kind of unbelievable that this was being offered to us. But even then, I was like, personally, I never saw myself as an engineer. That was never in my perception of my future. At school, I was much more interested in more like liberal arts kinds of things. I was really interested in history. That was my strongest subject at school, and English. And when I went on to university, I was doing lots of artsy things. I was doing philosophy and I was doing languages and linguistics and things like this. Nick went on to study proper computer science and electrical engineering at university. But I was still, even after building Soulver and building Picturesque, I was still like, this is kind of just a hobby. It's making money, which is really cool. And we're having all these amazing adventures and we're going to America and we're meeting these great people. But I was never really, I still hadn't really kind of started considering myself a proper programmer, a proper engineer, even though things were working. Going to Apple and actually working on some Apple things did give me a lot of confidence in the sense of, wow, I can actually do this stuff. And I'm actually, I had to pass an interview to get in to the internship program. And while I was there, I was working with other Apple engineers on things. So it was like, cool, maybe I can do this stuff. But I think what was just the really kind of key thing in my journey in particular was Soulver itself. This idea I just felt had so much potential, was so cool, and it was still pretty slow kind of getting into the world. No one really goes looking for something like Soulver because it's a new kind of thing. You might go looking for a calculator, but the whole point of Soulver was to kind of get rid of the calculator. You don't need the calculator. It's just like self-calculating paper, but no one really knows they need that until they try it and go, oh, this is much better. But people did. Certain people found it and they started using it, and they would email us being like, this is just an invaluable tool to my day. I've always got Soulver open. I'm always using it for little back of the envelope calculations and little what if explorations of my life and different problems I have. And so it was kind of that being met in the world by other people who recognized that this was a really good thing and relying on it with their own conviction that this was really kind of a revolutionary tool that just kept me going, because I kept thinking of new ways to make Soulver better and better. The thing that was really exciting me was, in addition to being a nice Mac productivity app and kind of replacing the calculator, was the idea of actually coming up with new ways of helping people solve mathematical problems, which the calculator doesn't really try to help you with maths. It lets you do basic arithmetic, but it doesn't really care about what you're working with. It doesn't know that you're working with currencies or dates, or it's not very helpful with percentages. This is one of the things that kind of brought us to Soulver 2 was like, I wanted Soulver to be more useful in the actual problem solving. So, for example, with percentages, if you want to find out what one number is as a percentage of another number, with a calculator, you have to try to remember, is it, so you divide the first one, the second one by the first one, you times it by, you have to kind of dip down into the level of mathematics to just solve your problem. Wouldn't it be much nicer to be able to just say, what is 20 as a percentage of 400 and get an answer? Things like that. I was like, this is going to be great. We could build in all of this extra help to actually make solving problems easier. We could build in live currencies. We could build in unit conversions. We could even build in stocks. So you could just type in 10 times Apple stock ticker and get answers. And that was for me like, wow, we could really make this even more and more useful. And I saw all these different potentials and possibilities there. And so that was, I guess that was the key that kept me personally motivated. So I mean, I really haven't done that much other than Soulver and Picturesque in my time as an app developer. I mean, I've been working on Soulver for 14 years now, and it still excites me, and I love how much people in the community love it, and especially with bringing out Soulver 3 earlier in the year, the response was just fantastic, and people were really, really thrilled. So I kind of almost feel this sense of responsibility as a kind of the custodian of this tool for the community, as well as personally using it every day and believing it's a really great thing.
So, Zach, what was it that you were doing when you were working at Apple? I mean, that sounds like a really interesting experience. Were you there for what, a few months or 6 months? What was that all about?
Yeah, we were there for 3 months. So it was over our Christmas summer break. So being Australians, we were both still at university.
Right.
And so we started in December. So we did December, January, February, which was a little bit sad because Apple has all these great programs for interns during the Northern Hemisphere summer break. Like you got to speak to Apple executives and ask Steve Jobs questions and stuff. They didn't have a lot on for us during the winter break, and there weren't a lot of other interns. But that was not the most important thing. The most important thing was we were at Apple. We were seeing how Apple worked internally and kind of experiencing the culture from the inside. And so I actually ended up on the iWork team, which was pretty cool. I loved the iWork apps. When Pages came out, that was just like, fantastic for me. And I'd been using Keynote before that as well. And so, I was on that team. I probably can't talk about the specifics of what I was working on, but nothing super important. Being an intern, they didn't want to put me on anything that was going to be like shipping or like a problem if I didn't do a good job for Apple. But
sure.
So I was in that group, and it was really interesting.
I got to imagine, though, that working side by side with Apple engineers has got to be both kind of inspiring as well as a great crash course in learning how to build software.
Yeah, it was. It really was. This is part of what caused us to write Soulver 2 after the Apple experience. That like you don't really want to rewrite your whole app from scratch because that's a lot of work. But after the Apple experience and with Nick's kind of years of studying engineering at university, we'd become so much better at programming and software architecture that we're like, okay, we just need to rewrite this thing from scratch because the old thing was written by kids who had no idea. Now we actually know what we're doing, so let's redo this.
You mentioned that one of the things you wanted to do with Soulver 2 was bring in more help in actually solving the various problems people might type in. And while one of the things that I love about Soulver is it's incredibly simple on the surface, but you can tell that there's a lot going on under the surface that's a lot more complex. And I got to imagine that building that kind of help in had to have been kind of tough because you're mixing both text and numbers and you have to anticipate the way someone might type out a particular problem that they have and they're trying to solve. Can you talk a little bit about what that evolution was like?
Yeah. So in fact, the original Soulver, the very, very first version we had, we kind of didn't foresee this. It was more just about the interface. It was about just getting things working, plus and minus and divide and times and stuff like that. It was only a little bit later when we realized, hey, we could make this math engine, as we called it, a lot smarter. We could make it ignore words so that putting in a random word didn't create an error internally. It just ignored it. And that was huge. We did that in 2006. As far as we know, we were the first people to ever do this. And it was like, wow, now we have this very flexible way of you can just express things how you're thinking them, and generally Solver will give you the right answer. It seems kind of like quite smart on the surface. Internally, it's actually just looking for mathematical things which have mathematical meanings and stripping out everything else. And that gets us most of the way. There's no artificial intelligence or anything like that going on. So, and then just adding on more features on top of that, where we observe certain phrases. If you're doing a unit conversion, you might have 10 kilometers in miles. Great, that's a unit conversion. We know that. We can evaluate that. Actually, it ends up being kind of like a programming language internally. There's a parser which looks into your expression and tries to find things which have meaning, and there's an evaluator which takes those things and gives you an answer, and then we just put that answer in the answer column on the right-hand side. That's kind of how it works.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by MacStadium, the only provider of enterprise-class Apple Mac infrastructure as a service. Did you know that MacStories runs entirely on a Mac Mini running at MacStadium? It does, and it has for years, but that's just one of many services that they offer. And today, I want to tell you about something brand new from MacStadium that's going to be especially appealing to the developers of the audience. But everybody should stick around because I've got a special deal to mention at the end for everybody. If you make a Mac app or an iOS app, you know that it has to be built using Mac OS running on Mac hardware. Unfortunately, this means that a lot of Mac dev teams are stuck using their own in-house hardware, whether that's Mac Pros or stacks of Mac Minis crammed under someone's desk. Here's the thing, though. It doesn't have to be that way. MacStadium has solved this problem by making Mac private clouds available in enterprise-grade data centers around the world. They're like AWS, Azure, or GCP, but for Mac hardware. And recently, MacStadium introduced Orca. That's Orca with a K, which stands for Orchestration with Kubernetes on Apple. Orca allows Apple OS development teams to use container technologies like Docker and Kubernetes the same way their non-Apple peers do. Orca takes standard macOS VM, puts it inside a Docker container, and then uses Kubernetes to orchestrate everything, all on Mac hardware. It sounds strange, but it's also intriguing, right? Because here's the thing, MacStadium has tested this, and they found that it's performed nearly 30% faster than other virtualization platforms in their beta. To learn more, head on over to macstadium.com/appstories to get started with an Orca private cloud. And whether or not you're a developer, having a remote Mac server like the one we use at MacStories opens up a lot of interesting automation and other possibilities. And right now, you can get half off your first 2 months of a new Mac Mini subscription with the code AppStories at checkout. Again, that's macstadium.com/appstories to get started with Orca and to use the coupon code AppStories at checkout to get 50% off your first 2 months of a Mac Mini subscription. Our thanks to MacStadium for their support of the show.
So let me ask you, Zach, because I was listening to this and so I had a thought of like, how do you sort of resist the temptation of adding new features all the time, like practicing restraint, if you will, in terms of like deciding which features are Soulver-y enough to make it into the app and which ones, maybe not. So is that something that you need to think about a lot?
Yes, I do think about that a lot. So one kind of guiding principle for me with Soulver is that I really want it to be this kind of very day-to-day-esque kind of app. I don't want it to be too mathsy or too scientific, because I feel like that's a very particular place that rarely apps come along to fill. There's a lot of apps for more mathematical, scientific kinds of things. And actually, the whole kind of feeling of mathematics is often a lot kind of off-putting to people. You remember maths from high school, you might remember this thing that was like hard and complicated and stressful, and that's the last thing I want Soulver to be about. I want Soulver to be friendly and approachable and for you as a regular person working through day-to-day real problems, not for someone doing something obscure and difficult. And so I've kind of always tried to steward Soulver in that more day-to-day direction. If I can come up with some kind of feature that would help a real person do real day-to-day like things, then that's something I'll want in Soulver. If it's something like working with matrices or imaginary numbers, more mathsy things, then I'm happy to leave that for another tool. And there are other apps that do that kind of stuff, and that's great. But it doesn't feel like that's core to Soulver's identity and being. That's how I think about it.
Right. And speaking of which, I have to assume that such a long career over the years, a few other apps must have tried to sort of copy the Soulver approach. Has that been a problem for you? Is that something that you had to handle to deal with that over the years?
Yeah. So there's been lots and lots and lots of copycats of the Soulver UI, and that's capitalism. That's life. You make something great, and someone's going to copy you. This is how it works. Apple has this all the time. They'll make something great, and then Samsung will copy them, or Microsoft will copy them, or this is life. I think the way I look at it, though, is there's kind of like good productive copying, and there's kind of like plagiarism, where nothing particularly new is generated. The world is not really particularly advanced from that, just copying someone else's idea and passing it off as your own. I think, like, in terms of Soulver in particular, there's a Windows Soulver-like thing called Opal Calc, and that's kind of Soulver on Windows. And on the guy's website, he says, I was looking for something that was like a notepad kind of calculator thing. I found Soulver. Soulver didn't exist on Windows. I made a Windows version. Here it is. I love that. There's this very honorable kind of acknowledgement of the lineage of this product back to where the idea came from originally, because it does kind of hurt when someone passes off your idea as their own. That to me was quite a respectful and approach. And when someone emails me saying, hey, are you going to do a Windows version? I say, hey, this is Opal Calc. Check it out. It's kind of like Soulver for Windows. Enjoy.
Nice.
The other one I really like is there's an app called Calca. And this was, again, it was a Soulver user who found Soulver kind of lacking in particularly in areas around doing more kind of sciencey, mathsy things. And had this idea for maybe you didn't need the answer column along the right. Maybe you could just get rid of it and put in a particular symbol, and then that would trigger evaluation on that line. But by default, maybe you're just typing text comments and you would explicitly request evaluation. And Calca's a pretty cool app. I thought that was an interesting evolution or kind of riff on this idea of notepad calculators. And when that app came out, I thought, okay, maybe this is the next kind of evolution in this field. And that was actually, I was kind of fine with that. Steve Jobs talks about this idea of adding layers of sediment to a mountain, and that is the progression of technology. And maybe Soulver was just this one layer, and the next layer was Calca. And I played around with it, and I liked it, but I kept going back to the Soulver UI. And I actually, after that, I started really experimenting with lots and lots of different variations on the theme of notepad calculators. There was, playing around with this idea of maybe commenting first. When you write something, it's not evaluated, it's just a comment. Maybe we didn't need the answer column on the right. Maybe we could make this simpler in that way. I tried lots of different things, and I kept coming back to the Soulver UI as the most natural and the nicest one for me personally. So I made the decision to just continue with that direction, and that kind of brought us to Soulver 3, and no plans to stop that trajectory into the future. I think it's a great design. And in fact, Apple's Swift Playgrounds is kind of inspired by Soulver. When that came out, I was like, oh, wow, this is like Soulver for code. It's very Soulver-like. There's a column on the right showing the result of programming expressions on the left. And in fact, I got an email from an Apple engineer on the team saying, hey, Soulver was actually a great inspiration to us as we were building this feature. It's like, that's really cool. So the Soulver UI is now gone into other areas outside just mathematics. So I think it's a really natural UI to have answers in one place and kind of text in another, or problems on the left.
I think it is an interesting UI. You've really hit on something, because it occupies an interesting ground that's somewhere between a calculator and a spreadsheet. I mean, I know so many people who are really good at spreadsheets, and they use spreadsheets in the way that other people would use Soulver just because that's what they know, but it's really more tool than you need to do a lot of day-to-day calculations, which is why I think Soulver is such a good fit for so many people if they discover it. And, you mentioned Soulver 3, and I guess I want to explore what is unique and different about 3, because we reviewed it on MacStories, but why don't you explain it to me in your own words?
Sure. So I was actually pretty happy with Soulver 2. For me personally, it did a lot of what I needed out of Soulver. Thought it was pretty good. But over the years, I got a lot of feedback, a lot of feature requests from people. And I would often just create... I basically had a list of these features. Every single feature that got requested, I'd put in the list. And often they would duplicate. And so I would just kind of add one to that particular feature request. And so over time, it became clear that people using Soulver wanted some quite particular things. And so for Soulver 3, I decided to just take on the top 20 feature requests that people had asked for. And I did all of them. So the big two were date and time calculations and subtotals. So that was the most requested one, so I did those first. And then there was just these kind of rough edges on the product that I thought could be better. So I would, in my use of Soulver, I'd often have lots and lots and lots of untitled documents all over the place. And Soulver's an interesting case because we built it on the standard macOS document infrastructure. But with Soulver, sometimes you do want a document. You do want to create a set of calculations that you want to save and look back on later, but often you just want to do a more lightweight, quick calculation. You may not care about the result of that later on. You just want to get to an answer. And so in 3, I tried to make both of these things work well by going to a more note-style UI where you didn't have to explicitly save a document. You didn't have to have all these windows all over the place. You would have this built-in sidebar with your sheets. And if you wanted to, you can make a new document. You can save it to your disk. But by default, it seems a better default to just be able to create new sheets and for quick calculations. And you can, they're all saved, so you can use those as to reference later on as well if you want to. So that was the real kind of inspiration for the feature sets of Soulver 3. But the internals of it was something that I was kind of even more excited about doing. And this was really inspired by Swift. Swift is my favorite Apple product of recent years. It's so wonderful. So the original Soulver 2 was written in Objective-C, and Swift came out in 2014. And as soon as Swift came out, we knew that this was going to be the future. I remember reading through the documentation of this language on the day it was released. I wasn't at WWDC that year, but I was reading the documentation. I was just like almost in tears. It was so beautiful. It was so great. And so one of the things we wanted was to rewrite the entire Soulver UI and all the internals in Swift, just because it was going to be a much nicer way of coding going forwards, and it would be a better foundation for the future. So Soulver 3 was a complete rewrite from scratch in Swift. That's why it took a long time, but I think it's going to be really great. And Soulver 1 went for 5 years. Soulver 2 went for 9 years, kind of almost 10 years. So kind of hoping Soulver 3 will be the foundation for the next 20 years, and it's logarithmic in that sense.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Linode. With Linode, you can instantly deploy and manage an SSD server in the Linode cloud. And you can get that server up and running in mere seconds with your choice of Linux distro, resources, and node location. Linode serves their customers with the help of 10 data centers spread around the globe, and they're about to add even more. Mumbai, India, and Toronto, Canada will both have data centers before 2020. Linode features native SSD storage, a 40 gigabit network, and Intel E5 processors. That means you're able to serve your customers even faster than ever before. And so that you don't have to stress about overspending, Linode has designed their pricing tiers to feature hourly billing with the added bonus of monthly caps on all plans and add-on services, such as backups and node balancers. We use Linode at MacStories, and what we love is that it's incredibly performant, stable, reliable, and has great competitive pricing. You really can't ask for more. Linode has pricing options to suit everyone's needs. Their plans start at 1 gigabyte of RAM for just $5 a month, and they offer high memory plans starting with 16 gigabytes of RAM. And Linode has a special offer just for you. As a listener of App Stories, you can go to linode.com/appstories and use the promo code AppStories2019 to get $20 toward any Linode plan. On the 1 gigabyte of RAM plan, that's 4 free months. And with a 7-day money-back guarantee, you really have nothing to lose. Give Linode a try today. That's linode.com/appstories and the promo code AppStories2019 to learn more, sign up, and make the most of that $20 credit. Our thanks to Linode for their support of the show.
And all of these features, and I assume the rewrite is also happening on iOS, right?
Yes, yeah. So
Nice.
this was a real challenge for me working on this big update, because Soulver is a multi-platform app. It's on the Mac, it's on iPad, it's on iPhone, and in rewriting from scratch, I really tried. Of course, the most natural thing would have been to release it on all 3 platforms at once. That would have been ideal, but I'm the only engineer on Soulver these days. Nick's working for a startup in Sydney called Canva, and so as a single engineer, I was burning out. I was trying. I was implementing a feature on the Mac, and then I'd do it on iPhone and iPad, and it was just too slow. It was just too hard. And then I read this great article. I can't remember where it was. It might have been on Basecamp's Signal versus Noise or somewhere else. But it was this idea of, if you're doing a big rewrite, you're doing a new product, maybe it's okay to release it alongside your old product. Maybe you don't need to replace everything at once. Maybe you can do this. Maybe you can keep the old product going for a while and alongside the new one. And this might be good if you're changing things up, if you're removing certain things, and also just to, in our case, get a sense of how alive Soulver still was. It's not a subscription app; it's a pay once app. So I don't do any kind of analytics or tracking, so I didn't really know exactly how many people still loved Soulver, still cared about it the way that we do. And so there was this sense of, well, maybe I'll just focus on the Mac version. I'll do that. If people love it, then I'll go and do the iOS ones as well. And if they don't, if no one really cares, then I won't have put in more energy than necessary in doing it for every single platform. So yeah, that's kind of where that came from. And of course, people are a little bit confused, and I get very frequent emails saying, when's the iOS version coming out? I'm working on it. So yeah, right now, Soulver 2 is still ongoing. I'm still updating it. It's still out on the App Store for Mac and iOS, and Soulver 3 is just for Mac right now.
I wanted to ask you, Zach, about the Mac App Store since you just mentioned it, because I know Soulver 2 is still available there and Soulver 3 is not on the Mac App Store. What was the thinking behind that?
If Soulver on iOS didn't exist, I think I would have just cancelled Soulver 2 and replaced it everywhere with Soulver 3 on the App Store and off the App Store. Mm-hmm. But because Soulver 2 still exists on iOS, I thought this would be the most natural way of making sense of this, having Soulver 2 and Soulver 3 in the App Store at the same time. Firstly, I'm not even sure Apple would allow that. I haven't seen that done by the developers. Maybe you can. I wasn't really sure. But just being a bit confusing. So I thought I'll just keep it Soulver 2 on the App Stores and kind of Soulver 3 for early adopters direct. Yeah, and I think often, my sense is that often people who are downloading Soulver are often Mac enthusiasts like me, like you guys, people who do go looking for third-party apps and downloading them. I often see that Mac users are kind of divided into these two groups. There's people who just don't even touch their docks. You see them and they're using the Macs and it's just the stuck standard dock configuration that you get when you boot up Mac OS X for the first time. And then there's people who have customized the docks and they're going out and they're looking for apps and they're customizing the system and they love their Macs in this kind of passionate way. And so I think that Soulver is still very much in that kind of second camp. And people like that are, I think, generally fine with downloading software outside the Mac App Store. A lot of people actually prefer it to support the developer directly and to go to the website and download it. It's not a problem.
That makes a lot of sense. I was wondering mainly because, over the years we've seen a lot of apps leave the Mac App Store and not return. I mean, there's been a push, obviously Apple has kind of revamped the Mac App Store. Some notable apps like Transmit and BB Edit have come back. And it sounds like from your standpoint, you don't have an issue with the Mac App Store. It's just that given where you are with Soulver 3, it didn't make sense to have it there at this point.
Yeah, it was more that Soulver 3 is this transitionary point from Soulver 2 into just Soulver 3. I've got nothing against the Mac App Store. I buy some of my apps from the Mac App Store. I buy some of my apps off the Mac App Store. I think it's great that on the Mac we have that option. That so you can, if you do end up in a situation where the Mac App Store isn't perfect for your particular situation, you can still distribute software off it. I think that's wonderful. Yeah, I think the Mac App Store is fine. I think I have some wish list items for it, as I think most developers do. The biggest one for me is just being able to set particular prices, different price points for different customers. So, for example, it'd be great to be able to give student discounts. It'd be great to be able to give away free copies to Apple employees, which is something that lots of developers like to do. And you can only do that outside the Mac App Store. Stuff like that. I think the Mac App Store could be better, but I have no problem with it, and I do intend to be back there with Soulver 3 once I have iOS versions available.
Yeah, that's great to hear. I mean, I do worry about the Mac App Store, mainly because it's been redesigned and it's got editorial content, both of which I love and I think is a great feature to bring over from iOS. But, you've kind of hit on a few of the things. There are a lot of business side aspects of selling through the Mac App Store that aren't available on the Mac that are available on iOS. There's also things like, Test Flight and the inability to do cross-platform bundles, other things that I think would make life a lot easier for developers who are on the Mac App Store.
Yep, for sure.
All right, Zac, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really great talking to you. Soulver is an app that has been on my Mac for a long time, and if listeners of the show haven't checked it out before, they should definitely go check it out now. Where Zac, can people find Soulver and learn more about it?
Yep, so the best place to go to is soulver.app. That's SOULVR.app. And you can download a free 30-day trial and play around and see if it's for you.
All right. Thanks again for joining us. And of course, thanks to our three sponsors, Lunar Display, Mac Stadium, and Linode. And as always, you can find me and Federico over at MacStories.net. Federico is at Vitici on Instagram and Twitter. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees, JOHNVORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.